Dear students, dear guests, welcome to the opening lecture of our joint seminar, Global Governance and the Role of Cities. This course is a partnership between the Global Awareness Education at the University of Tübingen in Germany and the Federal University of ABC in Brazil. In this course, we will address various perspectives on the topic, such as challenges faced by big cities, sustainable cities, migration, and health issues. We will have guests from different countries and contexts to contribute with lectures, which will be interspersed with more practical classes in which students will do case studies on Latin American, African, and Asian big cities. In both universities, the course is offered to students of different disciplines. In Tübingen, as part of the Transdisciplinary Course Program, and at the Federal University of ABC as a free extension course. The course organizers are Professor Gilberto Rodrigues, Federal University of ABC, and me, Dr. Glaucia Peres da Silva, University of Tübingen. We are very proud to have united more than 40 students living in 10 different countries: Belgium, Brazil, Germany, Italy, Mexico, Portugal, Romania, Spain, United States, and Venezuela. We counted more than 15 different nationalities. They are studying in their bachelor's, master's, some are PhD candidates and also professors, while others are employed in municipalities or government bodies. With such a diversity, we hope to have productive discussions and learn lessons of cooperation that reach well beyond the classroom. To open our event, we are delighted to have Professor Saskia Sassen as a guest. I invite Professor Gilberto Rodrigues to introduce our guest.
Thank you, Glaucia. Hello, everyone. It's our pleasure to introduce Professor Saskia Sassen, our lecturer today. Professor Sassen is Robert Lynn Professor of Sociology and co-chair of the Committee on Global Thought at the Columbia University in the USA. Her research focuses on globalization, inequality, and urban sociology. She was one of the first scholars to debate the topic of global cities, identifying and describing a new phenomenon brought about by globalization. Her book, The Global City, Princeton, 1991, is now a classic on the topic and was translated in several languages. It's a great pleasure to have Professor Saskia Sassen among us.
So for us, it is not easy in our complex settings. Just think of any big city. How do you detect that something has really changed? There is a foundational transformation. That does not mean that everything changes. That just means that certain key elements enter the picture, new types of elements that will make a difference. In complex systems, it is not easy to detect always that something has changed, that we have entered a new epoch. After all, the buildings are the same, the cars mostly are the same, the people have the same complaints, et cetera, et cetera. So what allows me to argue that something has changed, and that in there lies also a research option. We have to really go digging to understand what has changed. Why is something different? Now, I would say, just to help the students understand more clearly, that visually and in some other ways, you can detect that something has changed. For instance, in many cities, there used to be a respect for modest households. In other words, not the grand buildings, etc., but also the modest. Well, that is changing. That's just a very simple example that I'm giving you. That is changing. A lot of those houses that at one point were actually there, think of a city like Paris, think of a city like New York, etc., modest houses which were occupied by very modest income people. Those modest houses have been changed into fairly expensive houses, which exclude a lot of those people who used to think and used to experience that they could occupy those houses. I hope that this is clear, but this is like the simplest version of this transformation. We see in most of our major cities, more and more older buildings that were meant for more low-income households becoming more and more expensive and more chic. Now, that might be beautiful for the leadership of a city. A lot that everything, instead of having a lot of modest housing, those modest housings are transformed into rather chic houses. So the leadership of a city might feel very proud about that. And those who have money may certainly be very, very happy to see more and more beautiful buildings. But of course, what that does is leave out, guess what? The poorer people, people who used to live in those houses, but now cannot afford it. Now, this item that I just mentioned, this is happening in more and more countries across the world. That what were once residences where lower income people could live is now being transformed into higher income. Why? Because there is a growth of higher income entities of all kinds, and they are able to dominate the space. I consider this a very serious problem, a very difficult problem to change. It's not going to be easy to change that, but you see it in more and more cities. And that is something I believe that we need to address. So if we can generate new sources of income to enable the lower classes, the lower income classes, to have access to housing, that's okay. Even though the houses will be less nice than the older period where it was housing for the poor, but it was nice housing, it was good quality housing. Now we're losing that a bit. So that's already a bit of a negative, but allez, it's better than nothing. But what about rising waters? What about all kinds of other things that we're confronting? We're recognizing, and this comes back to this notion, we have entered a new epoch. We are recognizing that something has shifted, and it's intense, it's serious, something is happening. So that means that really, number one, I do not worry about high income households. They will be fine. What I worry about are the poor and a growing sector of middle classes that 15 years ago, 20 years ago, could access good housing. They were recognized as serious additions in a city's world. And today they're losing and they're losing and they're losing more. And some families, we all know that, some families that used to live in good houses, not luxury houses, but just good houses, now are on the street. And they hide themselves because they feel humiliated. But they should not feel humiliated. It is us, those who are still doing fine, who should actually address this. Now that then makes me think, coming back to where I started, that we have entered a new epoch. And my question, my hope in a way, is that by phrasing it that way, there is at least a beginning of a real discussion in many, many situations. So we confront, I think, a difficult period. We know the rising waters. We have seen all the incredible disasters that have happened just in the last 6 months that have eliminated housing certainly in the Americas, for all kinds of people. Why? Because of water, the water rising. I think many of you must have heard about this set of housing. These were people who lived in a reasonable neighborhood. This was in the United States. In a reasonable neighborhood, the water went way, way up. Oh, and the people who suffered the most were those who were at the lower level, at really often below ground level. There the water came and they all died. Do people remember this incident? This happened not too long ago. This was very dramatic. These were people they had, a nice house, so to say, not a luxury house, but a nice house. and the waters rose so much as they never had before, evidently. I don't know if never, but not in the recent past, that they died. They died in their own houses because of this rising water, this water that rose and rose. Now, this was a very dramatic moment. I would be very curious to see if most of the students have heard of that. I would be surprised if they hadn't, but if they have not heard of it, it's worth checking it out, because it really tells a story about where we are at. And when I say where we are at, I mean this, back to my earlier phrase, we have entered a new epoch. Now, the question of waters rising, etc., that it certainly doesn't happen in every part of the United States. We know that, but it happens in some parts, and that's enough. That already eliminates certain zones that we counted on to have housing, etc. They're gone. So there is a shrinking also that is happening very slowly, but it is happening, that is going to put underwater more and more land that we thought was going to stay dry. So we really, in that sense, I come back to this notion that we have entered a new epoch, but in complex systems. It does not mean that everything changes. It just means that a few things change in some situations to generate a kind of crisis. Now, if we just focus on the question of housing, we know that the housing question, I was just ending on this image that we have entered a new epoch, but the new epoch does not make itself visible in all formats. It often is quite invisible. But thinking about this notion should surprise us less. This notion that we have entered a new epoch should surprise us less when a catastrophic event happens. We should learn, rather than saying, oh, well, this is just a rare thing that just happened. No, I think we're going in a certain direction. Now, let me immediately add a footnote. There are many parts of the world where what they're suffering from is lack of water, okay? So I just want to make sure it's not in the whole world that this water rising is the drama. No, in some parts of the world, there is no water. And that is its own catastrophe in many ways. Now, sort of moving towards a final set of issues. The question then is, what do we do? Well, I think Europe, as I already mentioned, Europe has actually managed these things better. But even Europe, if you remember, for instance, it wasn't, not in Germany, I think, but one of these countries also suddenly found itself with a part of that country, found itself with rising waters, you know. So this is something that some countries, I think, will be able to handle better than other countries. From my perspective, the Americas, especially the whole South America part where I grew up, is going to have a harder time managing the losses that they will experience. I think Europe should be in better shape, but Europe has just experienced very dramatic waters rising. But immediately what you find a bit in Europe is that they will then act on what needs to be done. And in the United States, I don't know what it is, it's more difficult to succeed, that the leadership of a city, for instance, actually begins immediately to address the matters. I'm Dutch. I grew up in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, half that country, as you all know, is under water level. But they don't have the crises that we have in the United States and in some parts of the United States. So it tells you something. It tells you that the kind of innovations that we need have to be of a certain kind. It can't just be frou-frou. No, we're talking serious stuff. Those who have capacities to build new formats, whatever the types of formats might be. It could be housing, it could be how we handle water, etc. We need more and more people who have those talents, the talents to understand what we are confronting and how we handle it. In many parts of the United States, you have kind of, thinking about the housing question, for instance, we have a kind of ignorance. Because we have not experienced it, but it is slowly advancing into the United States also. But in Europe, for instance, they are far more aware of what is happening. Same thing in Japan. There are certain countries, and Japan, Japan is mostly one huge rock. So it has to be serious, and it has created extraordinary innovations to address that. It has invented new types of materials to handle what is coming. So anybody who's really interested in this subject, check out Japan, because they are simply in a vanguard in terms of the knowledge zone and the innovations that they have. And they have long been that. This is not new. I mean, it's a big population, a small country, small because most of it is rocks. Can you believe that? I mean, that's a tough one. So I always think of the Dutch, where mostly there's water, too high water, and then the Japanese, who really also have invented extraordinary materials and things like that in order to combat the water, but they do it in a very, very serious way. This is not an easy, quick, whatever. Now, the United States, in some parts of the United States, is really experiencing, I think many of you know that, is experiencing rising waters that are not going to die. They are going to stay and probably become higher. The United States is not quite as ready to confront this, even though it has so much open space. It should be easier than Europe. Europe is absolutely overwhelmed with people. But the Americas will have to really, suddenly they will have to wake up and understand that something needs to be done. Now, it is interesting, if you want, to think what we're confronting. I mean, it is a change. It is something we were not ready for, though we knew that it was happening. The experts had already talked about it. How are we going to proceed? And I'm thinking, I know that there are people here from many different parts of the world, but I'm now thinking about the United States, which is where I live and where I have experienced more of these things. So I, as I mentioned, there's one tragic element where those houses that were just beneath the surface, those people died, who were just beneath that, just beneath the surface. Remember that. I mean, that is a horror. They slowly died. They could not get out of their little houses. That is the kind of stuff that we can no longer do. We have to really learn from existing knowledges, which are already very advanced on some of these issues. We really are going to have to take this very seriously, even if most of the United States, for instance, still has a lot of dry land. I mean, it's not covered in water. So anyhow, that is sort of a third element that for me matters a lot. Finally, since I would like to hear your questions also, finally, there is a whole set of other challenges that we're beginning to confront and that we should take seriously. And that is the whole question of the materials that we use to build. There are certain countries, Japan, Netherlands, that are experts, really, really experts of how to make materials work, invent materials that we need, etc. Many, many other countries, and certainly in the Americas, do not have that. And that, I think, is a very serious issue that is simply not being recognized mostly. Certainly experts, they know the stuff and they will talk about it, but the general population does not have a sense of that. In Japan, every single person in the general population is aware of that. They are ready to detect something is not working as it should. They are totally engaged by the reality of, a lot of water, not a lot of land, a lot of rocks, so et cetera, et cetera. We don't quite have that now, I think. I mean, of course, there are institutions where that is happening, but your average citizen, because in the case of the Japan, it's the average citizen who is also well informed. They know exactly what to do and what not to do. They know when this is rising like this, we're in trouble, etc. They begin to move their operations to other spaces, etc. So how we in the United States, we have vast amounts of land that is very dry, that is desperate for water. Are we using it well? Not always, really not always. If the Dutch were, I don't want to say anything offensive here, but if the Dutch were in charge of the Americas, it would be different. They would have generated an extraordinary variety of innovations that prevented future disasters. We in the United States, we don't have that. We really don't. And I mean, we have certain, of course, we have very specialized people. We have a lot of, but that's really for rich and for grand institutions. It's not for the average person. So then the final point, how do we people, just plain people, how do we handle this, And it seems to me that we as professors should really begin also, and many of course are doing that, to begin to consider this notion that we have entered a new epoch. Taking that seriously is an invitation to detect, to discover, to understand a whole variety of conditions that right now we easily sort of let go, we say, oh yeah, we know, but we don't know. And so I find myself now in my classes, for instance, talking more and more about rising waters, all those entities that we for the longest time had the luxury not to think about. Everything was fine. There was a lot of empty land, etc. And now we are in another moment. And again, and my final repetition of the phrase and my final conclusion, we must seriously recognize that we have entered a new epoch, and we don't know exactly how it's going to work out. If you look at the sciences, a whole bunch of innovations that have been developed over the last 10 years or so are actually, some of these innovations are emerging as very useful for these types of catastrophic potentially events that I have been mentioning about, at least some, not all. And in a case like the United States, there's very little making of connections, of those things, that very simple situations, certain housing situations, certain, streets, whatever it might be, covered in water, etc. We sort of let it pass. We don't put enough of an effort. Now, I'm now talking about the United States. I'm not talking about all these other countries, because I know I'm Dutch, the Netherlands, they have done extraordinary work, as I already mentioned. And there is a whole bunch of other countries like that have done that. I'm just thinking about, mostly I'm talking here, I repeat, about the United States, because the United States is a good example. A lot of wealth, a lot of power, a lot of this, a lot of that, but a neglect, like a willful ignorance about what is coming. And I leave you with these very not so happy final elements. Thank you. Very important point. And I just actually wrote a piece where I was arguing that the connectivities that are developing nowadays, worldwide, and that are the most significant ones, are not national governments, but it's cities, especially, of course, major cities or cities that might be small, but that are playing a very crucial role. So it seems to me that something has really changed, But again, as I like to say, in complex systems, we don't always see it. But when you think about the ways in which even minor cities can become significant and needed actors, in this global world, either because those are cities that have the resources that are needed or the particular materials or whatever it might be, or all kinds of other reasons. So to me, of great interest is how the national level is losing ground. It does not impress us much if you think about it. There is not much coming out. I mean, there are exceptions. I'm sure that also in the Americas, you have these very particular countries that have very innovative people. This is beginning to happen. But largely speaking, to a very large extent, I think that national governments have lost ground, and that's a pity, I think. But cities have gained a certain kind of ground. Now, the challenge that cities confront is, of course, the question of the low-income sectors. If cities matter more and more, we're going to have more and more low-income people in cities who are going to be expelled towards, larger areas. Now, this is very much what I'm thinking about is the United States. So in Germany, in Paris, in France, it might be very different. So I'm mostly really saying all of this out of the perspective of the United States, which the United States is, as we, I think, all know, is a peculiar entity because it is so brutal. There is a kind of brutality that is built in for that that kind of country to grow, and Europe still just has found, I would say, a better format. Listen, so I think there are two sort of vectors in play that can produce a bit of a confusion. On the one hand, cities have not weakened. Cities, the interesting point for me is that cities now, for the international sphere, matter more than national governments. National governments are losing ground. We need them, but they're losing ground. Whereas it is other actors that are more operational, if you want, that are really moving stuff around, so to speak. I don't mean literally moving stuff, by the way. I just mean, that are aware of options, that make connections with other countries, etc. That is what is dominant when you look at it from the perspective of firms that want to, make money, I guess is one way of putting it. But the other form of thinking of it is firms. We all need firms for this or for that, right? So I don't mean to give it a totally positive angle, but that we need firms. We need certain types of firms, for food, for this, for that. So to me, what is interesting is how it is cities that are in demand internationally. It is not national governments. Now, there was a time when it was national governments. If a foreign actor came to a country, they had to deal with the national government, so to speak. This has now really changed. There is a lot of activity happening that simply passes by the whole operation of the state. Now, in some countries, it's still very rigid, but mostly it is, it seems to me like the governments of these countries are not even interested in learning what it means, to check into all of these increasingly complex forms of money making that we have. It's not simply about money. These are very complex systems, as we all know. So something has really changed. We don't have a name for it, And so for me then also is this other issue that I already mentioned, is that we tend to think that a country is a country. Well, yes, a country is a country, but increasingly it is the cities in particular countries that are the dominant actors internationally. So you have even very modest cities that have, say, a claim to being the best producers of who knows what, that are really rising in interest. And some of the governmental institutions sort of losing ground, or they are a bit lost. I mean, I often find that some govern, not all, some govern know anymore how to do their work, because everything is changing. And again, if you can take an image sort of in your heads, this notion that the international sphere is so dominated by cities and not by national governments. That's a major transformation. Yes, we still need national governments, but something has changed. We don't have a name for it yet. You know, it's not necessarily visible, but we know that it exists and it has made a difference. So there is a kind of transversality in play that can avoid a lot of the governmental institutions, etc. Now, that didn't fall from the sky. That was partly made. You know, there were actors, people, entities that decided we need to change this and that and blah, blah. And it varies a bit from country to country, clearly. But it is very interesting to see that the key actor in the international zone is not necessarily the national government. It is, in fact, a whole bunch of other actors which have their own sort of, one could say in quotation marks, rights to conduct themselves across the world. And I'm not just talking about the United States, I'm also talking about other parts of the world. What is happening is extreme. This is an extreme event. The big question that we don't have an answer for is this the first step of a certain kind of transformation? My sense is that no, at least not yet. I think that what we're seeing happening is an extreme case. And Putin, he couldn't help himself. I think it's a very stupid move on his part. You know, really stupid, mindless grabbing. And I can't say how everything will end, but I don't think that he will succeed in after. And you can already see, because it's like a much longer war than he planned for. So Putin simply got it wrong. Now, is he capable of brutal changes that will really affect a lot of people? Yes. The brutality is, I'm sure most of you have read about it. It's extraordinary. I mean, it is something that really, it's just on another level. It makes you think a bit about certain earlier wars, you know, but it is truly extreme. The question that I have also in this, on this subject is, what should we do? What should we, the citizenry, do? You know, we who are not directly affected, because what is happening is that the people who are being, you know, who have to hide, or, I mean, it's, well, I don't need to elaborate on that. But what is it? How do we, the citizenry, respond to this? It's an extreme case. So, and so my question, and I don't have a clear answer either, my question is there a particular kind of response that we should have, which we don't have? You know, it's a bit of a wobbly system right now. Yes, we know how many people are feeling, you know, the pain of these countries, of this country, mostly one country, but still, you know, it really, for me, it marks a difference. We have seen many brutal situations, World War I, World War II. You know, brutality is not an unfamiliar element, but there's something peculiar about this. And I, again, this is maybe not the subject to really extend too much on, but it is something peculiar. And clearly, Putin thought it was going to end very quickly, and it isn't ending very quickly. So what happened? Now, my opinion of Putin keeps going down just a little. I mean, he's not stupid, but he's more stupid than I thought. Before he launched this, I thought this guy actually is a dangerously smart guy. Well, I don't think that anymore. I think that, and we know that instead of a quick war, he has, 3 months already of war and is not going that well still, etc. So I think Putin got it wrong. However, there might be future. I mean, Putin also opens up a possibility for other grabbers. Let's just use that language of grabbers. So, whatever the country or the institution that might want to grab another country. And he has opened up a door that is a nasty door that we have all had in our past, most of our countries. And so he's stuck now. And I think the stupidity, besides all the horrors, but I'm just thinking the stupidity is going to maybe help for more and more countries to avoid doing what Putin wanted to do. If Putin, with all his arms and powers, has not managed, it's already 3 months now, he thought it would be like that. That tells us something, and I don't want to forget that part. The worst part is, of course, the suffering of the people, etc. But in there hangs this little element. It didn't quite work out the way he expected. He thought it was like, just a brief invasion and everything would have been falling the way he wanted it. Well, it hasn't, not quite. I think we're going to see more losses, and Putin will probably surge in some ways, but in the longer run of history, a lesson has been learned. And that is that it is not so easy. We already knew that, but we had forgotten maybe. It's not so easy to do what he aspired to do. And with all his superiority, he is not been a great success. So he has failed in many ways. So that to me is an important point. I don't want to just think about the disaster that it has been, the horrors. I also want to think about the stupidity of a pretentious and very powerful actor. Because next time we will be more ready to understand the mistake, the error, the presumption, I hope. And who knows where the next big, element of that sort appears, in what part of the world. We don't know that. But Putin has shown himself to be an extreme, but also we have understood his limits, because he thought it would last, like whatever, 5 days. No, it isn't. But it's a tragic event. So I think that we have to change our manners, so to speak. So I really, one of my sort of things now that I'm really working on is how do we manage to generate new cities for the simple reason that our existing cities are growing bigger and bigger. If you are rich, or if you are semi-rich, or if you have just a good job, all right, you can handle it. But at the edges of the system, there is despair. These are workers, as I already mentioned, that have to get up at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., of the night, and never sleep enough, etc. So my battle is that we need to stop expanding our big cities, because this is an invisible crisis, but it is a terrible crisis. It's unfair, it's unjust. How far I can win that battle? Probably zero, no matter. I keep talking about it because I think it is an important issue. We cannot overlook the fact that so many workers have to never sleep enough, and the invisibility of their long trips. I have so many friends who never thought, they're beautiful people, critical minds. They never think about these workers who have to get up, at 4 a.m. every day of the week to do their jobs, to have that money, etc. So for me, the notion is we need to build new cities. And as I said, whenever I say that, people look at me like, but no, we have all the cities that we need. Well, no, that's a fantasy. We have cities that at some point are just self-destructing at the edges, and the ones who suffer are the poorer people. So yes, we need to stop this notion that we can generate endless stretches. The elites and just the middle classes who can live in the good central parts of the city don't even notice. They never think, they never encounter the sufferings of all of those other people who day after day do not sleep enough, die far too young, etc. To me, this is a crisis that we have, and it's not only here, it's in many parts of the world. So that is a key element. Now that then brings up this whole question that I already mentioned. We need to build new cities. And just try it with some friends. You know what? We need to build new cities. I can guarantee you, well, I'm not 100% sure, but that they will look and say, we need to build new cities. I mean, we have all these huge cities. Yes, we need to build new cities, and we need to stop the endless expansion, which is an invisible event for most of the middle classes and the rich. They don't see that. They have what they need. I think that we should really recognize the value of these smaller cities, number one. Number two, in our bigger cities, one option, since they already exist, and they are built in stone, so to say, one option that we could develop, which I have seen happen a bit in Europe. Now, Europe is a bit more advanced and more daring than the United States when it comes to how we handle cities. But what I see happening is the concentration. So you have a huge city. Paris is a huge city, right? It's really huge, but it has divided itself in ways that just about everywhere you have easy access to the basic shops that every household needs. In the United States, very often it's all concentrated in one big setting. And if you live far away, it's going to take you forever to get there. It's a real hassle. So the Paris model, Paris is a huge city that is in the business of every, a certain dimension deserves to have all the basic necessary things for daily life, the shops that you need. And that has worked beautifully. Most people can walk now. They can walk to there, and it's smaller shops that they have, but the shops have everything. If you go to Paris, pay attention. And that means that you have far more people walking from their homes to the little shop. The little shop has the basic stuff that every household needs. If you have something fancier, then you go to another place. Well, to me, that is really a good innovation. And the leadership in Paris, as we all know, is really it's women. They have done it very, very well. It's a very good. These are little interventions. They don't cost a lot of money. But they enable the local people. You have all of these little, different sort of setups. Again, I repeat, Paris is a huge city, but now most people are just walking to the shops they need. That is a victory, on many levels. And so I leave you with that happy thought. Well, it was a great pleasure to talk with all of you. Et à la prochaine. Hein?